I am Diane Durante, and this video is on the methodology of my timeline 1700 to 1799. That book will be available on Amazon and Ingram in early September 2025. Incidentally, feel free to just listen to the audio of this YouTube video because the slides are interesting but not essential. But first, before we begin, back in October 2024, I posted a YouTube video on why we need to study history. If you're not yet persuaded that there's value in learning about the past, you should watch that video before you watch this one. The introduction that appears in Timeline 1700 to 1799 is a revised version of the Substack posts that the YouTube video is based on. So, assuming you're still here or you're back, in this video I discuss how I wrote the timeline, with details that range from how I decided which entries to include to choices about formatting, excerpts and illustrations, and page layout. Now you might say, why are you bothering, Diane? Well, the first reason is that history includes a lot of facts, and it is possible to present them in a very skewed narrative. As an avid reader of history, I appreciate it when an author explains his premises, his goals, his methodology. Such information is the equivalent of knowing where the food I'm about to ingest came from. If I don't trust the purveyor, then the food is suspect. And the second reason for doing this is that I am a methodology geek. I have often learned useful tips for my own work, for method rather than content, by listening to engineers, physicians, sculptors, painters, and others talk about their process. Books by Walter Isaacson, Eric Larson, Johan Norberg, Russell Shorto, among many others, have helped me refine the way I write my own books. Podcasts by Cheryl Atkinson, Lex Fridman, Doug Brunt, Russ Roberts suggest improvements in how I approach my research, or sometimes fascinating trails to follow. So this video, the appendix that it's based on in Timeline 1700 to 1799, is a thank you to them and all the other people whose methods I've adopted and adapted over the years. To restate that more briefly, this is a descriptive rather than a prescriptive essay. Take what's useful, leave the rest. Let's talk first about software. Over the past 25 years, I've published a couple dozen books on art and art history. The Appendix 2 in Timeline 1700 to 1799 talks about some of them, including the ones on screen. At this point, I have a writing routine for essays and books. I scribble a quick one-page outline on legal paper so I know the main points I want to cover, and I know that, yes, there is actually a point I want to make. Then I type a draft in Microsoft Word, I print it out, I make it bleed. I buy red fine point Pilot G2s by the dozen. I enter the corrections into Word, I print out a clean copy, and I edit it again and again and again. When I am down to very minor edits, I lay out the text and illustrations for the print version in Adobe InDesign. In 2022, I put together Timeline 1900 to 2021 in Word as usual. At that time, the routine turned out to be a problem. The book had more than 1,000 entries. In Word, it was really difficult to maintain a consistent style for the entries and to add cross-references and to track sources. So, for the Timeline 1700 to 1900 project on Substack, I changed the routine. I did the research and editing in a FileMaker database with a separate record for every entry. I suppose a spreadsheet might have worked, but I hate spreadsheets and I love FileMaker. The FileMaker database for the timeline has a record for each item, and that record includes the entry, the main text, plus its category, its date, an excerpt or illustration if that's relevant, the works that I consulted, and the index entries. Side note, putting the timeline together in FileMaker has been so much more efficient that I told Amazon and Ingram not to sell any more copies of Timeline 1900 to 2021 until I can issue a revised edition, which will bring the entries up to par with those in Timeline 1700 to 1799. Let's talk about some sources. To create the basic entries for the Timeline project in FileMaker, I wanted to start by reading a traditional sort of timeline, a history book with a lot of short entries covering a wide range of topics and places. For that, I chose a book that I have referred to so often that my copy is falling apart. The two-volume Anchor Atlas of World History was compiled in the 1960s by Werner Hilgemann and Hermann Kinder. It's currently published in English as the Penguin Atlas of World History. The atlas has more than 600 pages of dates and events. As the title implies, it also includes hundreds of custom-drawn maps and tables. These make me very happy because I love knowing where I am as well as when I am. If I could afford it, I would commission maps specifically for the timeline project. But I haven't got that kind of money, so I use what I can find for free on Wikipedia or in the Library of Congress or the David Rumsey map collection. The Atlas of World History aims to cover the whole globe from the Cenozoic era, 65 million years ago, to 2000 AD. I went through it looking for events from 1700 to 1900 that had long-term repercussions in the West, specifically on the US. Atlas entries such as the Stamp Act and the Battle of Culloden made the cut. Entries such as the invention of the breech-loading rifle and the establishment of the University of Moscow did not. Those are important events for certain topics, but not for the picture that I am trying to paint. At this point, I was gathering data rather than trying to write finished entries. My one unbreakable rule at this stage of any book is always paraphrase your notes. I never copy an author's words exactly unless I intend to quote them. Especially in these days of AI, I am acutely aware of intellectual property rights. If I don't copy-paste someone else's words, then I cannot absent-mindedly use those words without crediting their author. As I entered each item in FileMaker, I assigned a category: worldwide politics, US economics, and so on. In the source field, I noted where I originally found the information in this entry, in this case, the volume and the page of the atlas. When I fact-check, I want to be able to easily find my original source. For another perspective on the period 1700 to 1799, I worked through the timelines in Chapter 9 of Charles Murray's Human Accomplishment, which includes sections on astronomy, biology, chemistry, earth sciences, physics, mathematics, medicine, and technology. Within each section, Murray printed in bold the items he considered most important. Although I didn't always agree with Murray's evaluation, I appreciate that he was willing to make such judgments. It's similar to what I do in selecting the major events and trends for each decade in the timeline. And it's not an easy job to choose the particular people or events that either influence the future most or sum up the past. I also worked through Murray's Appendix 5, which lists major figures in Western painting and sculpture, literature, and music. Murray compiled these lists statistically based on which artists were discussed most frequently and most extensively in authoritative sources. I did not always agree with which artists were determined to be most important as a result of those statistics. There is a fair amount of recency bias at work, but it was worthwhile to check the lists for any major figures I might have missed. As another way to add to my list of major figures and events, I curled up with Printing in the Mind of Man. PMM, as it's known to its many devoted fans, began as the catalog of a 1963 exhibition of the most important works ever printed, starting with the Gutenberg Bible around 1455 and ending with a 1940 speech by Winston Churchill. PMM entries were compiled by experts in the relevant fields. If PMM says a work is the first or the most significant in a particular field, few scholars would argue with that. Just a side note, Printing in the Mind of Man is not for sale as an ebook, and it is unfortunately out of print, but you can probably find a used copy. In this first stage of writing the timeline, I also worked through a couple handbooks that I always keep within arm's reach of my desk. That includes the Random House Dictionary of Art and Artists, Sutton's Western Architecture, and a Reader's Companion to World Literature. One can count on books such as these to include all major artists and authors. Again, I often disagreed with the author's interpretation of the significance of these artists and writers, But at this point, my goal was to have at least a placeholder entry for every significant figure and event. I would make my own evaluation when I started working through the first draft, and at that point, I would have a better knowledge of the context. Moving on to the organization of the timeline. I debated for quite a while over the best way to organize the timeline. I own Schlesinger's Almanac of American History, which is organized in strict chronological order, and each entry has a symbol before it to show which of a dozen or so categories it belongs to, painting or technology or whatever. Find that multitude of symbols very confusing. In human accomplishment, Murray has a separate chronological timeline for each category, but that makes it difficult to see what's happening in several fields simultaneously. The best compromise I could come up with was a decade by decade format that divides items within the decade by categories. I had another long debate with myself, because problem solving is so much fun, over where to place the illustrations and the excerpts. Placing them right next to the main entry would have made it very obvious that an image or an excerpt belonged with that entry. But it would also have made it difficult to quickly skim the main entries, because there would be a lot of extraneous stuff on the page. PK books have so many illustrations that they often seem visually chaotic to me. That's one of theirs on the upper left. In addition, the text for the timeline is 3 columns wide. More about that later. And I wanted the option of making an image 2 columns wide if I thought that it was important enough. A 2-column wide image within the main text would make page layout really complicated. By which I mean I would have to spend a great deal of time on layout that I would much rather spend researching and writing. For the same reason, I rejected putting images and excerpts at the foot of the relevant pages. In Financial Programs of Alexander Hamilton, I put footnotes at the bottom of the page. All those footnotes were substantive, mostly quotes from Hamilton as contemporaries. I really wanted people to actually look at them, so footnotes rather than endnotes made sense. Unfortunately, it was a time-consuming and tedious process to get the footnotes into their proper places in financial programs and to keep them on the right page when I inevitably did further edits of the main text. For instance, this underlined word, that means there's a footnote. As soon as I add 2 pages on this page, that will go to the next page, and then the footnote will have to move. It's difficult. So, the bottom line, as I said, is that time and energy I spend on layout or time and energy I cannot spend on writing. So in the timeline, I went for the simple option. Items with images and excerpts are flagged in the main text with either the section squiggly symbol or paragraph return. The illustrations and excerpts appear at the end of each decade. Rather than dividing them again by categories, however, I put the illustrations and excerpts in strict chronological order. I like the juxtapositions that this sometimes creates. In the 1790s, for example, portraits of Napoleon and Washington are side by side. And on the same page, there are excerpts from works by George Washington, John Adams, Malthus, and Coleridge. Water, water everywhere, nor any a drop to drink. Moving on to the first draft. By this point, my FileMaker database had hundreds of entries. The next step was to do a first run-through, cleaning up the entries. That actually meant starting to write, but I find it easier to sit down and face a blank page if I don't tell myself, now I'm going to write. My first step was to find all the entries in a particular category and sort them by year. If an entry seemed unimportant compared to the rest, then I deleted it. Then I started fleshing out the entries that were left. For example, I did not want to just mention the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714. I wanted to state the major combatants, what they fought about, how the war related to previous events, and what its long-term results were. It also occurred to me that for a long-term perspective, meaning a perspective over centuries, and for a sense of scale, it would be interesting to give details of one major battle for each war. How many soldiers were on the field, how many were killed, wounded, or missing. That meant researching enough about every war to find out what the major battles were. To find such information, I usually started with the Britannica Online. At about $6 a month, Britannica is a bargain. The Britannica's entries are usually more clear, more concise, more objective than Wikipedia entries. At least that's true for the 18th and 19th centuries, maybe even the early 20th century. On matters such as recent US presidents, Britannica can be almost as skewed as Wikipedia. After I digested the Britannica article and summarized my own take on it in a few sentences, I often cross checked the draft entry against the introductory section of the Wikipedia entry for that topic. I am very wary of Wikipedia's content. Its contributors are overzealous with making adjustments in articles that are related to current hot topic issues, slavery, women, Palestine, etc. Even so, Wikipedia now and then showed me an aspect of a topic that I had missed or that needed more emphasis. I did use Wikipedia for dates, like dates of battles, for the number of troops on the field in major battles, and for casualties in war. Looking at the entries by category, sorted chronologically, occasionally showed me gaps. For example, if there wasn't even one entry for architecture over a 30 or 40-year stretch, then I picked up an art history text to find out what was going on. Occasionally, Britannica, Wikipedia, and Printing in the Mind of Man provided enough information that I could write an entry. But sometimes I discovered that I could not state the importance of an event in my own words. When I found myself tempted to merely repeat what one of the sources had said, that was always a red flag, a signal that I needed to do more research because I did not understand what was going on. Speaking of more research, Grok, which is my AI of choice, is great at handling questions such as briefly explain Chladni figures and did Hannah More's thoughts on the importance of the manners of the great to general society really sell millions of copies? Even for such very specific queries, however, the AI sometimes provided an answer that sounded wrong based on my knowledge of the period and the topic. It comes back to integration. If you know a lot, you're likely to spot when AI is hallucinating. If you know nothing, then anything it says might seem plausible. There is no AI substitute for a well-informed, questioning human mind. While I was writing the first draft of the timeline project in FileMaker, I also added cross-references when I saw connections. Rather than stopping to look up the date, I usually typed cross-references in the way you see at the lower right with a double underline and a note of what it is that I'm looking for. When I'm ready to edit the draft, I can simply search for the double underline in FileMaker and then fill in the blanks. And the reason for this is that it takes a while to get into the writing zone, the part where it feels as if it's just flowing. And if you stop to look up dates, look up specific facts, then the zone goes away. So the double underline trick is great for when I don't want to stop writing, but I know that whatever I'm saying is not, haven't got the right date, haven't got quite the right word. While I was drafting the FileMaker entries, I also started reading nonfiction books related to the period I was looking at. Several books by Paul Johnson were invaluable for making connections that were not obvious at first glance. Those include his History of the American People, The Birth of the Modern, which covers 1815 to 1830, and Modern Times, which covers the 20s and the 1920s through the 1990s. Of more limited scope, but also quite useful for details and a sense of perspective, were works like Tim Marshall's Prisoners of Geography. While reading these general works, I was on the lookout not just for major events, but for important trends, such as the rise of nationalism and romanticism. For entries such as those, I tried to find a seminal or defining event that I could pin to a specific date in the timeline. For example, the entry for Romanticism is at 1798, which is the year Friedrich Schlegel published one of the earliest praises of Romanticism. The entry on nationalism is in the 1770s, when the colonies in North America began to unite in rebellion against Britain's control of their government and economy. That isn't the first ever instance of nationalism, it's far from it, but it is a vivid example of the trend toward nationalism just when it becomes widespread. Okay, The next step was editing by decade. After drafting the entries by category, so I would look at poetry from 1700 through 1799, I switched to finding all entries for a particular decade and then sorting them by category. This is the way entries appear in the final timeline. Seeing the entries in the context of other events of the same decade often allowed me to see important connections and make necessary corrections. At this point, I also chose which entries would have excerpts and illustrations. I was shooting for at least half a dozen of each for every decade. Usually I found more. I tried to use illustrations that are famous and/or that you might have seen in an art history survey. I'd like you to be able to slot the images that you might have seen elsewhere into the chronological pattern of the timeline, pieces into a jigsaw puzzle. So here, for instance, Death of Marat. Most people have seen the Death of Marat somewhere, sometime. Also, it's easier to find decent quality images of famous works than of not so famous works. My FileMaker database has fields for the URL of the illustration that I want to use and for the caption that will appear in the book, including any credit line that's necessary. For the same reason, the excerpts are mostly from works you might have heard of, if not read. I tried to choose excerpts that are revealing for their style or for their subject, such as this one from a proto-romantic work. This is Walpole's Castle of Otranto from 1764. Quote, "And then the figure, turning slowly around, discovered to Frederick the fleshless jaws and empty sockets of a skeleton wrapped in a hermit's cowl. Angels of peace, protect me!" cried Frederick, recoiling. "Deserve their protection," said the spectre. And here's a quote from a work that was written barely a decade before the French Revolution toppled France's monarch and nobility. This is Beaumarchais, the Figaro Trilogy, 1778. "Just because you are a great nobleman, you think you are a great genius. Nobility, fortune, rank, position, how proud they make a man feel. What have you done to deserve such advantages? Put yourself to the trouble of being born, nothing more. For the rest, very ordinary man. Whereas I, lost among the obscure crowd, have had to deploy more knowledge, more calculation and skill, merely to survive, and has sufficed to rule all the provinces of Spain for a century." End of quote. Alas, I have not read all the books that are listed in the timeline. The excerpts often come from skimming a book in Project Gutenberg or on Kindle, or from looking at snippets of the book that are cited on Wikiquote. From searching out those quotes, my already long reading list has gotten even longer. Moving on to formatting for Substack, which is where this series originally appeared. Substack frequently reminds me that a large percentage of its readers use Substack's mobile app. For 0.683 seconds, I considered laying out each decade of the timeline in the form of a web page. After all, I laid out timeline 1900 to 2021 as a scrollable ebook. An ebook is not all that different from a long web page, or is it? Scrolling on a small screen through hundreds of entries would be extraordinarily tedious. Even worse, I doubt anyone would bother to flip back to check cross references in the same decade, never mind in a different decade. But the cross references are one of the unique features of the timeline, and I really want people to look at them. A fixed page format that allows the reader to flip back to earlier pages made the most sense. And so I decided to send Substack supporters PDFs of the timeline project that were laid out just as the print book will be laid out. For those who prefer reading in digital format, I will make a PDF version available, but the text will not be flowable. A word to those of you who have been receiving the timeline month by month. Thank you so much for your support. I really appreciate it. When I started the timeline project on Substack, I honestly believed that I would be able to simply publish the century, all 10 decades, as soon as I issued the decade of the 1790s. I really should know myself better. By the time I was editing the 1780s and 90s, I was making substantial changes to the earlier decades. So if you want the definitive version, you need to buy the book in print or as an ebook. Moving on to getting the text from FileMaker to Adobe InDesign. As I said earlier, I usually lay out all my books in Adobe InDesign. Writing the entries in FileMaker rather than Microsoft Word complicated the process of getting the text into InDesign. In FileMaker, I searched for the entries for each decade, sorted them by category and date, then exported them as a text file. Because InDesign is made for layout rather than editing, I opened the text file in Word and did minor tweaks, such as applying styles to the headings, applying italics and bold, and adding the symbols that mark illustrations and excerpts. Then I put the Word text into InDesign. When deciding where to break the columns and the pages, I allowed at least an inch of empty space at the foot of the page. I knew from writing Financial Programs of Alexander Hamilton that right up until the moment when I click publish on Amazon or Ingram, I will not be able to resist making corrections and additions. So I figured if I allowed an extra space at the foot of the page, I would be less likely to have to adjust column breaks on multiple pages. Even so, if you flip through Timeline 1700 to 1799, you will notice that many pages have hardly any margin at the foot, which is an infallible sign that I added so much material to the entries in that decade that I had to use up my whole margin. You can see that on the right. Another reason for wide margins is that people have different interests and priorities. Allowing extra margin on each page will allow them to add items to their copy of the timeline. After breaking the pages in InDesign, I did a final edit and polish. That included checking every single cross-reference to make sure it was accurate. It was a very tedious process, but there's not much point in having cross-references if they lead to dead ends. And yes, the print version of the timeline does include an index. More on that in a moment. That makes the accuracy of the cross-references less crucial, but accurate is still always better. After all the main entries for the decade were laid out in InDesign, I went back to FileMaker, found all the excerpts and the captions for the illustrations, sorted those in chronological order, exported them, and pasted that text file into InDesign at the end of each decade. And then I manually pasted in each image above its respective caption. Next up, the reasoning behind assorted aspects of the page layout for the print version of Timeline 1700 to 1799. Page size. Each page is 8.5 by 11 inches to allow many entries on facing pages. However, the page is laid out in 3 columns so the lines are not too long. It is a simple biological fact that reading long lines fires your eye muscles. You've probably noticed this, at least subconsciously, if you've ever tried to read the text on a web page that runs the width of a 20-inch monitor. About chapters. Each decade opens on a right-hand, an odd-numbered page. When I'm flipping through a book, I like to know where to expect new chapters to be in. Headings. I use Desdemona for the main category headings. That's this here. Desdemona is legible, but it's distinctive enough that it stands out from the main text if you're skimming a page. Subcategories, which are found only in science and technology, are in small caps. This, math and physics, earth and space. That the small caps sets them off without the addition of italic, which I use only for titles of books or musical works, or bold, which I use only in the excerpts and illustrations section to set off the year and category. Too much italic and bold makes a printed page look too busy. I gained this kind of knowledge from my days laying out catalogs for a bookseller. If you're curious about that, see Appendix 2 in the timeline. Running heads. Running heads are over here at the side so that you can flip through the book very quickly and find the decade that you want. The decades have to be easy to find because the references in the index, and all the cross-references as well, are by decade and category, not by page. And the illustrations and excerpts appear, as I said, at the end of each decade. They start on a new page, but it can be either left hand or right hand, depending on where the main text ended. A few points of style rather than layout. For every entry, the year goes first because it's easier to skim that way. So 1800 parenthesis August 1 rather than 8/1 1800. In timeline 1900 to 2021, so the one that's not available currently, I would give a year but often no month or date. For the Substack timeline project, I always give a month and date if it's possible. That month and date often matter a great deal. In 1774, the page shown here, you can see the tension building in America if you sort the events properly by date. First come the Coercive Acts in March, the Quebec Act in June, the First Continental Congress, September, Samuel Seabury's Free Thoughts on the Proceedings of the Continental Congress in November, and in December, Alexander Hamilton's first polemical essay, The Full Vindication. Cross-references. I am not vain enough to assume that you're going to read every entry in every category of every decade. So I repeat the cross-references even for entries that directly follow each other. The aim for the cross-reference citations is to make it as easy as possible to find the entries they refer to. If there is a month, date, and year, then I give all three. If there's only a month and year, I give the month and year. If an event runs for multiple years without a starting month and date, then the cross-reference will be by the years. There is one quirk about the cross-references. Some entries mention more than one event or work. For example, the entry for the Siege of Toulon, August 29th, 1793, mentions Louis the 17th, with a cross-reference to January 21st, 1793. The entry for January 21st, 1793 is actually about the execution of Louis XVI, but it mentions the deaths of Marie Antoinette and of the heir to the throne who was known to royalists as Louis XVII. Now we're on to the index. Including an index in timeline 1700 to 1799 was not a given. I usually publish my books without one, on the assumption that a reader can always do a word search in an ebook version. That works for single topic books where the potential search words are likely to be used in the text. But in timeline 1700s to 1799, there's a very wide range of subjects. Working all possible search terms into the text would have made for long and repetitive entries, so an index seemed like a better solution. Having decided to include an index, though, I had to make a lot of other decisions. Would I index every single item? Bohemia, folk dances, Edgar Allan Poe, as well as major events such as the American Revolutionary War and the French Revolution? Yes, I would. I've been known to judge how interesting a book will be based on the amount of finicky detail in its index. Would I index the titles of all books? Yes, I would, because sometimes you just can't remember the author's name. Would I index the nationalities of artists, authors, inventors, and so on? I had cut that information from the text for the sake of space, but I have it in my files, so I indexed that as well. I am also the sort of person who will have a niggling memory of an author's thought-provoking throwaway reference, and it really annoys me if I can't find it because the author didn't think it was important enough to include in the index. Because of that, I have leaned toward including more entries rather than fewer. I indexed the authors and podcasters that I mentioned at the beginning of this video as influencing my work. I indexed the medieval manuscript with a star sapphire on its clasp that I mentioned in Appendix 2. I index the images that appear on the opening page of every decade because often they are larger and therefore easier to scrutinize than the images in the illustrations and excerpts pages. How to refer back to the text within the index also required some thought. The usual choice is obviously by page because that's the shortest. And I might have saved 5 or 10 pages from the 28-page index had I used page numbers. But if I tell readers to look for Secret Police in one of the 3 dense columns on page 127, are they going to bother? Saving a few pages in the index would come at a hefty cost to the readers. So instead, the index references are by year, month, date, plus category. Finding secret police under 1799 November 11th world is much easier than finding it somewhere on page 127. As a bonus, giving references by date and category also tells readers where to find the illustrations and excerpts, which are flagged with the section symbol and the paragraph symbol. Those appear at the end of each decade in chronological order. The only time I use page numbers is for references to the introduction, to the centuries and statistics pages, to appendices 1 and 2, and to the combination of images that appears at the beginning of each decade. Just a few more points of style. Readable font size. Had I set this book in 10-point type, it would take far fewer pages and would therefore be less expensive for you. But for those of us who are over age 40, reading that size of type is a headache. So the main text is set in 11 points. The index, which is just for occasional consultation, is in 10-point. I made the entries skimmable. They're designed so that you can look down a page and see what each is about without having to read the whole text. For example, at one point, the entry for Fuseli's 1781 painting began, quote, "The public is shocked by an edgy erotic painting of a demon." I changed that. It begins, "Henry Fuseli, The Nightmare. Public reacts with horrified fascination to this edgy erotic work, a demon hovering over a sleeping woman." Jargon. I don't like jargon. I avoid jargon, especially in economics and science. If I cannot explain something in layman's terms, then I do more research until I can. Verb tenses. I generally use the present tense because I think it makes history more immediate, more lively. If there's a reference within an entry to a previous event, then I use the past tense. And in the preliminary overview called The World in 1700, I used past tense for any event before 1700. Also, non-PC/DEI terminology, a trigger warning for you. As a historian, I read a lot of original sources and I read a lot of scholarly works that date to the mid-20th century and earlier. I am very much accustomed to certain terms such as Indians, slaves, and immigrants. Acceptable terms for these have changed several times since the 1960s or so. But if you search in a scholarly work of 1930 for terms such as indigenous peoples, enslaved people, migrants, you're going to draw blank. I will, with a sigh, accept your right to change the historical terms if you can get others to use these new terms, but I am not going to try to keep up to date. And the last point of style has to do with translations of titles of books, music, and operas. I give titles of books and essays that are written in foreign languages in English. The rare exception is when the work is widely known by its foreign title, such as, for example, Hugo's Les Miserables. The only exception to this is opera titles. Today, operas are usually performed in their original languages, be it Italian, German, or French, so I have given the titles in the original language. Rinaldo, Hippolyte et Récit. The English translation is given only if the meaning is not obvious. For example, Die Zauberflöte is the magic flute. I hope you found something that you can use in this video. Have fun writing. If history interests you, please consider buying the timeline 1700 to 1799 and or supporting me on Substack. Thanks for listening.